17 tons of steel. A diesel engine running at full bore in temperatures cold enough to freeze the fuel in its own lines. And the official maintenance solution, the one actually written into the field manual, was to crawl underneath it with a tin can full of gasoline, light it and hold it under the transmission until the fluid got warm enough to move. That is not a war story. That is not an exaggeration. That is how the Caterpillar D8 was kept alive on the Alaska Highway in the winter of 1942. 11,000 soldiers, 1,600 miles of wilderness, subarctic forest, mountain ranges, permafrost bogs that could swallow a bulldozer whole, rivers with no bridges, and temperatures that dropped to 40 below before the sun came up. The Army had 8 months. 8 months to punch a road through terrain that had stopped every survey expedition for 20 years. 8 months because if the Japanese landed in Alaska, and in the summer of 1942, that was not a hypothetical. There would be no way to move troops or supplies to fight them. They built it. They built it in 8 months. And the machine that made it possible was a 17-ton iron beast that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through conditions that would stop a modern machine cold. But here is the thing nobody tells you about the Alaska Highway. 1/3 of it was built by men the Army tried to hide from history. Men who were sent to the most brutal sections of the route, given second-tier equipment, assigned to build in conditions that killed, and then deliberately kept out of every film reel and press photograph the government released. The highway got celebrated. The men who built part of it got erased. How does that happen? How do you erase the men who drove the machines and swung the axes on one of the greatest construction projects in American history? That question runs through everything we are going to cover today, and we are not going to let it go until we have answered it. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by subscribing and liking. Thank you, and now back to the gritty history. The road that couldn't wait. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, and within hours, the calculations changed for every military planner in Washington. Alaska was American territory, but it was effectively unreachable. No road connected it to the continental United States. Supply lines ran by sea, slow, vulnerable, exposed to submarine attack. The territory had 12 medium bombers and fewer than 22,000 troops protecting an area 4 times the size of Texas. Colonel Simon Bolivar Buckner, the officer commanding the Alaska Defense Command, was blunt about it. If the Japanese came, he said, he could not defend Alaska. He did not have the resources. The answer had been sitting in proposal form for over a decade. A highway, a road from the continental United States through Canada, across the Yukon Territory, and into Alaska. Military planners had been debating the route since the 1920s. The Canadian government had resisted for years. The road would pass through their territory, benefit almost none of their citizens, and cost them nothing directly but the political headache of letting the American military operate freely on Canadian soil. Pearl Harbor ended the debate in 72 hours. On February 11, 1942, President Roosevelt authorized construction. The Army secured rights of way through Canada by early March. On March 8, 1942, less than 90 days after Pearl Harbor, the first equipment began moving north on the Northern Alberta Railway toward Dawson Creek, British Columbia. The town had 600 people. It was about to receive 10,000 soldiers and 250,000 tons of construction equipment. Could a town of 600 people even absorb that kind of impact? The first shipments alone answer the question. 174 steam shovels, 374 blade graders, 904 tractors, more than 5,000 trucks, bulldozers, snowplows, cranes, generators. And at the center of all of it, 2,200 bulldozers, of which 1,850 were built by Caterpillar. The D8 was the backbone of the operation. 17 tons, diesel engine, a LaPlante Coate blade on the front wide enough to clear a two-lane swath through dense spruce forest in a single pass. 7 regiments of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were stationed along the route, not at one end pushing north, but at 7 different points simultaneously, buildings toward each other, racing the clock from multiple directions at once. Surveyors worked 10 miles ahead of the machines, staking the center line through terrain no road had ever crossed. Behind them came the pioneer teams, axe crews cutting the path through old growth, timber, and behind them came the dozers. 24 hours a day, in rotating shifts, the engines did not stop. They could not afford to stop. And here is why that mattered beyond the deadline. A diesel engine that went cold in -40-degree temperatures would not start again without external heat. Not quickly. Not in the field, with the tools available to a regiment operating in the middle of a wilderness in 1942. If a D8 went cold, it was dead until mechanics could get sufficient heat into the block to allow the fuel to flow again, a process that could take hours and required open flame next to fuel-soaked components, with no parts depot within 500 miles. The machines had to keep running, and when they broke, and they broke constantly, the mechanics worked on them outside, in the open, at ambient temperature, with bare hands that stopped functioning in 90 seconds of exposure. The route was drawn from a War Department map, following a line of existing airfields from Edmonton, Alberta, to Fairbanks, Alaska. Highway commissioners protested the moment it was published. The route on the map did not match the route on the ground. The terrain was rougher than the surveys suggested, the river crossings more complicated, the permafrost zones wider, and more unpredictable than any of the planning documents had anticipated. But there was no time to redraw anything. The route stood. They built without grades or curves in the early sections. Wherever the dozer would go, the road would go. The pioneer philosophy was simple and brutal. Get a passable track through the wilderness first and make it a road later. The result was a rough line through the forest that followed the path of least immediate resistance, with switchbacks severe enough to stop a truck and grades steep enough to roll one. And underneath all of it, something was waiting. Something the engineers had not planned for, had not trained for, and would spend months fighting before they fully understood it. The question driving everything in this story: how does a road cost so much in men and in machines? Starts with what was hiding under that frozen ground. The dozers were about to find out what permafrost does when you wake it up. But before we get there, understand what it meant to operate one of these machines in March 1942 in northern British Columbia. The D8 operator sat in an open cab, no windshield, no cab walls. The seat was steel, the controls were steel. At -30, touching bare metal with an ungloved hand meant tissue freezing to the surface in seconds. Operators wore as many layers as they could fit and still reach the controls, and then they sat exposed to whatever the subarctic threw at them for hours at a stretch, because the road did not build itself during warm-up breaks. They were building through old-growth forests at night, with headlamps if the machines had them, by feel and engine sound if they didn't. The surveyor's stakes marked the center line. The rest was judgment, experience, and whatever the machine could push through before the shift ended. In the first weeks of construction, the regiments were learning the terrain in real time, learning which ground would hold and which would give, which timber would go under the blade and which would throw the machine sideways. They learned by doing it, at speed, in the dark, at temperatures that made every mistake cost twice as much. what the D8 was, and what the ground was hiding. What does 17 tons of moving iron do to frozen earth? Not the earth itself. What is underneath it? That is the question the engineers should have asked in February 1942. Nobody asked it, because nobody in the planning stages had enough field experience with subarctic permafrost to know it needed asking. A Caterpillar D8 in 1942 was the most powerful tracked bulldozer available to the U.S. military. 17 tons of diesel iron, roughly 140 horsepower transferred through a clutch and brake steering system to two wide-set continuous tracks that spread the machine's weight across soft ground. The LaPlante Co-8 blade on the front was adjustable, could be angled to push material to either side, and was engineered to hit a standing tree at full throttle without stopping. Through subarctic boreal forest, black spruce, white spruce, jack pine, dense enough that the machines were pushing through a wall of living timber for hundreds of miles. The dozers did not navigate around trees. They drove through them, root, mass, trunk, crown. All of it went under the blade and got pushed aside. The machines converted millions of board feet of timber into cleared right-of-way without anyone picking up an axe. Tom Logan, a Caterpillar engineer serving as motor officer for the 340th Regiment, described it later. Through wooded expanses, the tractors pushed and uprooted millions of board feet of jack pine and spruce, converting them readily to timber for bridges and corduroy roads. The tracks were the D8's survival mechanism in soft ground. Where a wheeled vehicle sinks, a tracked machine floats, spreading its weight across the full length of track contact. In theory, in the permafrost zones of northern British Columbia and the Yukon, the theory had limits that nobody fully understood until they ran a D8 over them and watched what happened next. Here is what permafrost is. It is ground that has been frozen, sometimes for hundreds or thousands of years, with a layer of living vegetation on top. That vegetation, the moss and sedge and root mat of the boreal forest floor, acts as insulation. It keeps the frozen ground below from thawing. It is a crust, a lid, and when you remove it, when a bulldozer blade strips it away, the frozen ground beneath begins to absorb heat from the air, from the machine engine running on top of it, from the summer sun. What happened next was something none of the engineers had been trained to expect. The permafrost did not just thaw, it liquefied. The ice-saturated ground released its water content and became a slurry of black organic muck. The local word was muskeg, with the consistency of wet cement and the structural integrity of nothing. It did not support weight. It did not drain. It did not firm up. It absorbed. It swallowed equipment. In some sections it extended downward 15 feet or more, and a D8, 17 tons of diesel iron, sitting on tracks designed to distribute weight, would punch through the surface crust and settle, tracks churning, into black liquid ground, going nowhere. The machine that created the road could not cross it. That is not a metaphor. That is the operational reality that stopped construction for weeks at a stretch across hundreds of miles of route. Could they even get the machines out when they went in? Sometimes yes. Sometimes it took another dozer to pull the stuck one free, and by the time the extraction was complete, the road surface around it was churned into a wallow that would take days to stabilize. The engineers would push a section clear in the morning. By afternoon, the road was sinking. By the following day, it was a muskeg river. 6 miles a day was the best the regiments could manage in the worst sections. In the permafrost zones near Cluane Lake in the Yukon, construction halted entirely for 6 weeks while they improvised solutions. 6 weeks, on a project with an 8-month window. The solution was corduroy, an old technique brutal in its labor demands. You cut trees by hand with axes and saws, strip the branches, Lay the trunks side by side across the soft ground like a timber mat. Then you bring fill, gravel, soil, brush, whatever is available, and pack it over the logs. Then you bring the machines across. In some sections, the corduroy mat went down 15 feet before hitting solid ground. 15 feet of stacked timber and fill just to create a surface that would carry a loaded truck. Corduroy sections were up to 15 feet deep. Let that settle for a moment. The men cutting timber and laying logs were not building a road on top of the ground. They were building a timber raft floating on liquid earth and covering it over and calling it a road. And then summer arrived, and summer brought its own disaster. The thaw accelerated beyond what even the permafrost sections had done. Hundreds of miles of pioneer road that had existed on paper and on the ground in March turned to muskeg rivers by June. The trucks bringing supplies to the forward construction crews could not get through. The bulldozers that had built the road could not cross it. The Army began running a public relations campaign in August 1942, the Roosevelt administration assuring the press that everything was being done to ensure progress and safety. The August 31, 1942 issue of Time magazine described the effort as a task befitting Paul Bunyan. Nobody mentioned that entire sections of the Paul Bunyan Road were currently at the bottom of a permafrost bog. The summer of 1942 also brought something the soldiers had not been briefed on: the insects. The subarctic in summer generates mosquitoes, blackflies, and no-see-ums in densities that have to be experienced to be believed. The men working the corduroy sections, axes swinging, hands occupied, unable to swat, worked inside clouds of biting insects that did not stop from dawn to dark. On top of the cold, the muskeg, the isolation, and the unrelenting deadline. The summer months added this. It did not slow construction. Nothing was allowed to slow construction, but it is part of the record of what these men actually endured. And then there were the machines themselves. Keeping a D8 running in -40 temperatures was a crisis that never ended. Modern diesel fuel is formulated to resist gelling at low temperatures. The fuel available to the Army in 1942 was not. Below -20, diesel began to thicken. At -30, it stopped flowing through the lines. At -40, it gelled solid. The field solution was gasoline-filled tin cans, improvised torches, lit and held under the engine block, the fuel lines, the transmission housing, the hydraulic fluid reservoirs. Mechanics crawled under 17 tons of diesel iron in -40-degree darkness and held open flames next to fuel-soaked components until the machine could start. That was the official procedure, written into field manuals, authorized practice. Tom Logan, managing 18 D8s and 20 D4s for the 340th Regiment, said the machines seldom cooled their engines unless laid up for repair. And when they were laid up, his job was to see they ran again. Every repair was done outside at ambient temperature by men whose hands stopped working in 90 seconds of bearskin exposure. The machines ran continuously for months. The men beside them worked in rotations measured in minutes before frostbite forced them inside to warm up and rotate back out. But the machines were not the only thing being stretched past its limits on the Alaska Highway. The Army had brought a human workforce to this wilderness under conditions that combined genuine danger with deliberate injustice. And that combination was about to produce both the highway's greatest achievement and its most deliberately buried story. The 3 regiments nobody photographed. Here is the part that most accounts of the Alaska Highway leave out entirely. When the Army Corps of Engineers assembled the 7 regiments for this project in the spring of 1942, it did not have enough white engineer regiments available. Most were committed elsewhere: North Africa, the Pacific, Europe. The Corps needed bodies. It had three newly formed black engineer regiments, the 93rd, 95th, and 97th Engineer General Service Regiments, trained, equipped, and available. The Army's official position on black soldiers was explicit, written into training assessments, command evaluations, and the operational doctrine used to assign units to missions. Black soldiers could not be trusted under fire, could not handle heavy machinery responsibly, were not capable of the kind of independent, sustained construction the Alaska Highway demanded. Could they? Three regiments were about to answer that question, whether the Army wanted them to or not. The 93rd, 95th, and 97th went north because there was no one else. They were assigned white officers to command them. The segregated Army of 1942 did not permit black soldiers to command themselves, and they were given equipment, not the best equipment. The black regiments received older machines with more hours on them, machines that had already been driven hard. The white regiments got the newer stock, in conditions where a worn hydraulic seal meant a machine frozen dead in the wilderness. That choice had consequences. The 95th Regiment arrived at Sekani Chief River in British Columbia facing a problem. The river needed a bridge, a proper timber bridge, not a temporary crossing. The men looked at the timeline and made a bet. A month's pay, regimental honor, everything on the line. They could bridge the Sekani Chief in 4 days. They did it in 3. How? Working in rotating shifts. Men chest-deep in the icy river to set the timber piling foundations while the temperature of the water ran just above freezing. Full immersion in a subarctic river at near-freezing temperature gives a man minutes of useful function before hypothermia begins pulling his coordination apart. They worked in short rotations, men going in and coming out, axes swinging on the bank to cut and shape the bridge stringers, while the river crew set pilings in the current through the night and the following day and the night after that until the bridge was done. 72 hours. The achievement was noted in command reports. It was not photographed for public distribution. The 93rd was assigned the section from Carcross to the Teslin River. 70 miles of road through subarctic forest, muskeg crossings, and river obstacles that had stopped every survey team that preceded them. By June 16, 1942, Company A had pushed through to Johnson's Crossing, completing the road to the Teslin River. 70 miles in approximately 6 weeks of conditions that would shut down a modern construction project for weather alone. The 97th Regiment built the Alaskan section, the stretch north of the Yukon border into Delta Junction, under white officers, in the most remote and brutal terrain on the entire route, alone. As journalist and historian Lael Morgan later documented, the Alaska section of the highway was built solely by black troops of the 97th Regiment, under the command of white officers. The Corps of Engineers sent film crews to document the construction for public release. Newsreel footage went to movie theaters across the country. Press photographers embedded with the regiments sent images to newspapers nationwide. The Time magazine piece in August 1942 described the project as a feat for the ages. The film crews did not follow the 93rd, the 95th, or the 97th. The photographic archive released publicly showed white engineers and white operators almost exclusively. The achievements of the 3 black regiments, the Sekani Chief Bridge built in 3 days, the Teslin River Road, the entire Alaskan section, were documented only in internal command reports and morning rolls that would not become publicly accessible for decades. The Corps had not simply failed to document the black regiments. It had made a deliberate choice about what the public record of this project would look like. James Budd Osby Mitchell of Suffolk, Virginia, drove a truck and operated equipment with the 93rd through every condition the Yukon could throw at a man. He came home on leave with his toes and fingers frostbitten. He told his family he hated the idea of going back. He went back anyway, because he knew they had to finish the highway. That was part of his character, his family said. He passed it down to his children. His discharge record lists his service. It lists his medals. It does not explain what he built, or that part of the road running through the Yukon and Alaska exists, because men like him went back when they didn't want to. Researcher Lael Morgan spent years at the Rasmussen Library in Fairbanks, working through boxes of records, interview notes, private photographs, regimental rosters, reconstructing what was deliberately omitted from the official story. What she found was not simply an incomplete record. The omission was active. Film crews had been at the highway. Photographers had been at the highway. The coverage of the 93rd, 95th, and 97th was not sparse because nobody went north. It was sparse because the Corps of Engineers managed what the press was shown and where the cameras were pointed. The men who built a third of this road were not forgotten. They were excluded. There is a difference. Forgotten implies accident. Excluded implies decision. But the cold was coming back for everyone now. And when it came back hard in the autumn of 1942, it came without regard for rank, regiment, or what the Army's official policy said about who was capable of working heavy machinery. October, and the cold that came for everyone. By September 1, 1942, there were still 460 miles of road to build before the route was connected. 460 miles. And the Yukon winter was already beginning to arrive. What does that mean in physical terms? What does autumn at the Yukon border do to a construction operation running on diesel and human endurance? It means temperatures dropping below freezing before the first week of September is out. It means diesel fuel beginning to gel before the morning shift ends. It means steel changing its behavior in ways that summer never revealed. At -40, the impact resistance of mild steel drops sharply. Welds crack under loads they absorbed without complaint in July. Blade edges that took the force of hitting a buried root in August fracture in October. The machines the men had been driving for 7 months were becoming dangerous in new ways, failing in places that summer operation had never stressed. The autumn of 1942 was one of the coldest on record for the Yukon. It arrived ahead of schedule. Construction did not stop. The orders were clear. The highway had to be connected before winter sealed the route permanently, and the regiments drove the machines until the machines stopped. And when the machines stopped, they got the tin cans and the gasoline and got them running again. Could they make the 460 miles close before the winter closed them? The answer was not certain in September. It was not certain in early October. The window was real. The machines were showing the wear of 7 months of continuous operation. Hydraulic lines contracting in the cold and developing leaks, track pins freezing in their bores and needing to be driven out with sledgehammers before a machine could turn, bearings running dry in equipment that had been pushed past every maintenance interval. The men operating the machines in those conditions sat in open cab tractors, no enclosed cab, no heated operator station. The man on the D8 seat in the Yukon in October was exposed to the full ambient temperature. The wind off the mountains, the cold radiating up from the frozen ground, the exhaust heat from the engine offering a narrow warm pocket that disappeared the moment the wind shifted. They worked in Army-issue cold-weather gear, which was better than nothing and insufficient for extended exposure at -30. Frostbite was a standard injury. Men rotated off machines when their hands stopped responding and rotated back on when circulation returned. And then the Army showed in the winter that followed exactly what it thought of the men who had built the hardest sections of this road. On March 29, 1943, the highway complete and the black regiments idled in winter encampment. A young white lieutenant named DeWitt C. Howell ordered 10 black soldiers into the back of an unheated truck. The temperature was 34 degrees below zero. The destination was Fairbanks. The distance was 130 miles. The soldiers told him the trip would maim them. Frostbite at that temperature, in an open truck bed at road speed for 130 miles, was not a question of if, but of which extremities, and how severely. The lieutenant was in command. They were soldiers. In the back of the truck they went. The court-martial proceedings that followed charged the soldiers, not the lieutenant. That story, what the Army did with the men who built a third of this highway, once the highway was finished and the cameras were elsewhere, took decades to properly surface. But on October 25, 1942, the cameras were still out. Because there was one moment coming that would run in every paper in the country, and it would be impossible to keep out of the public record, no matter how carefully the Corps of Engineers managed the archive. Corporal Refine Sims Jr. was from Philadelphia. He was with the 97th Engineers working the Alaskan section north of the Yukon border. By mid-October, his dozer was pushing south through dense spruce forest, 20 miles east of the Alaska-Yukon line. Forward visibility from the cab was measured in feet. The blade pushed, the engine ran, the trees fell and went under the tracks, and the track behind him was the highway being born. Then the trees in front of him began falling on their own. He hit the brakes, put the machine in reverse, watched as a second D8 came through the tree line heading north. Private Alfred Jalufka from Kennedy, Texas, with the 18th Engineers, a white regiment, working the southern section from the other direction. North had found south. The two machines faced each other across the last gap. Sims and Jalufka climbed down and stood between them, in a cleared strip of boreal forest in the Yukon Territory. On October 25, 1942, they shook hands. A photographer from Engineering News Record was there. The image ran across America. 2 men, one black, one white, shaking hands over the last gap in the Alaska highway. The press described a feat of engineering. What the photograph also documented, without most of the 1942 newspapers quite saying it, was a black soldier and a white soldier standing as equals in front of a camera in a military and a country that kept them in separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate command structures, and separate equipment queues. Harry Truman would desegregate the U.S. military 6 years later in 1948. The photograph of Refine Sims Jr. and Alfred Jalufka became part of the argument for why it could work. Because it already had, on a frozen road in the Yukon, in conditions that didn't leave room for any argument that wasn't about whether the machine kept moving. The highway was connected, but the celebration was already being planned, and it would be, like the construction itself, a carefully managed story. What runs under the asphalt? Soldiers Summit. November 20, 1942. A ridge overlooking Kluane Lake in the Yukon Territory at mile 1061. 250 soldiers, civilians, and Royal Canadian Mounted Policemen stood in the cold as officials from the United States and Canada cut the ribbon. The outdoor temperature was recorded by the weather station. It was not announced. The Army censored it. Wartime provisions prohibited disclosing weather conditions that might provide information to the enemy. Attendees were documented as suffering exposure symptoms before the ceremony ended. The highway celebrated that day was not passable, not for most vehicles. The Pioneer Road bulldozed through in 8 months was exactly that, a pioneer road. Grades severe enough to roll a loaded truck. Switchbacks built not to engineering standard, but to whatever angle the D8 could push through in the time available. permafrost sections held together with the corduroy that was already beginning to heave and shift in the freeze-thaw cycle. Sections between Burwash Landing and Croydon, Yukon, became virtually impassable by May and June of 1943 as the permafrost thawed again, no longer protected by the vegetation that had been stripped away to build the road. A second corduroy layer had to be built over the first, then graded over again, then stabilized with gravel, then watched through the next winter to see what the permafrost would do to it when it thawed. The highway was not opened to civilian traffic until 1948. 6 years after the ribbon cutting at Soldiers Summit, the project cost $140 million, equivalent to more than $2 billion today. That covered the machines, the fuel, the materials, the bridging, the corduroy timber, the grading. It did not cover, because there is no line item for it, the frost-bitten fingers of James Mitchell, who drove through the Yukon for months and came home with damage that lasted the rest of his life. It did not cover the 10 soldiers ordered into an unheated truck at -34 to travel 130 miles because a lieutenant chose to exercise his authority that way. It did not cover the 70 miles of road built by Company A of the 93rd between Carcross and the Teslin River, for which almost no photographs exist, because the film crews did not go where the 93rd worked. What was erased during construction was further erased in the celebration. The official record of the Alaska Highway, as released to the American public in 1942, was a record of white regiments, white operators, and white engineers. The 3 black regiments that built a third of it, in some cases the hardest third, under the worst equipment and the most remote conditions, were written out. It took decades to recover what was lost. Historians Christine and Dennis McClure worked through the National Archives in Maryland, the Corps of Engineers History Museum in Virginia, the Army Records Center in St. Louis, and the Rasmussen Library in Fairbanks, pulling morning reports, rosters, interview notes, private photographs, to document what was built, by whom, and under what conditions. Their book, We Fought the Road, is the record that the Corps of Engineers chose not to create in 1942. The Burwash-Croydon section was rebuilt in the late 1990s to address permafrost issues that had persisted for over 50 years. The permafrost beneath the 1942 Pioneer Road, once the insulating vegetation was stripped and never fully replaced, kept thawing and reheaving in a cycle the road surface could never entirely accommodate. Modern cold region construction methods insulate the permafrost with a gravel berm, or replace the native soil with gravel immediately, before thaw can start. The 1942 engineers worked out that same logic in real time with corduroy and fill under a deadline that allowed no margin for study or error. Some of the original corduroy still underlays sections of the highway. The logs that the men of the 93rd, 95th, 97th, 35th, 340th, 341st, and 18th Regiments cut and laid into muskeg in 1942 are still down there, still holding, still doing the job that was asked of them 80 years ago, in a frozen wilderness, by men whose names were not written into the photographs. The Caterpillar D8 continued in production long after 1942, upgraded, enclosed, made safer, made smarter. The operator who sits in a modern D8 cab works in a climate-controlled environment with GPS guidance and hydraulic assists that would have seemed impossible to the men running the 1942 model in the open air at -40. The machine survived. It improved. What it cost to use it in 1942, in fingers, in lungs, in months away from home, in frostbite that never fully healed, was the price of the era. The highway was designated an International Historical Civil Engineering Landmark in 1996 at a ceremony in Dawson Creek, Mile Zero, where the equipment trains had unloaded in March 1942 and the first dozers had headed north into the wilderness. Corporal Refined Sims Jr. and Alfred Jalufka's handshake at Beaver Creek on October 25, 1942 became a symbol. The military presented it as engineering triumph. It was that. It was also proof, documented, on film impossible to suppress, that a black soldier and a white soldier could work toward the same thing and meet in the middle. Harry Truman used exactly that kind of evidence when he signed Executive Order 99 and 81 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces. The photograph of 2 men and 2 bulldozers in a Yukon forest was already part of the argument. What Sims and Jalufka connected that October has been paved over, upgraded, rerouted, and improved for 80 years. It carries tourists and truckers and military supply convoys through the Yukon and Alaska. It is not the road they built. The road they built was barely a road. What they built was the proof that it was possible. The tin cans of gasoline burned under the D8 transmissions at -40. The axes went into the muskeg timber in the dark. The frostbite came, the men rotated off, the men rotated back on. The 3 regiments nobody photographed built their sections. The cameras moved on. The road got celebrated in newspapers coast to coast, and the men who built a third of it went home to whatever was waiting for them. Frostbitten, unphotographed, and absent from the official record. The permafrost doesn't care about any of that. It's still down there, still thawing in the summer, still heaving in the spring, still reminding every construction crew that tries to build across it that the ground does not negotiate and does not keep promises. They built the road anyway. Every mile of it, they paid for every mile in full. The highway today runs 387 miles from Dawson Creek to Delta Junction, Alaska. It has been realigned and shortened from the original pioneer route as engineering has improved and the worst curves and grades have been corrected. The original 1942 road was longer, rougher, and less direct, a product of its construction method, which was to go where the dozer went and figure out the engineering afterward. What remains of the original alignment in some sections is the pioneer road beneath the modern surface. The corduroy, the fill, the improvised solutions that a regiment working under deadline came up with in real time. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the machines, not the roads, and not the decisions that put 11,000 men into a subarctic wilderness in the dead of winter with a deadline that didn't negotiate. Progress has a price. On the Alaska Highway in the winter of 1942, you could see that price in the damage on a man's hands.